She walked into that Houston apartment on April 7th, 1987, knowing 3 people would never walk out alive. Frances Newton was just 21 years old, a mother who had recently taken out $50,000 life insurance policies on her husband Adrian and baby daughter Farrah. When police arrived, they found Adrian slumped over the kitchen table, 7-year-old Alton on the living room floor, and 21-month-old Farrah in her crib. Each had been shot execution style with a .25 caliber pistol that belonged to Newton's boyfriend. But Frances had an alibi. She claimed to be apartment hunting across town when a drug dealer burst in and gunned down her family. For 18 years, she insisted someone else pull that trigger. Even as appeals courts turned her down, even as forensic evidence mounted against her, even as 3 members of her own jury began questioning her conviction. The night before her scheduled execution, Frances Newton refused her right to speak. She declined a last meal. She had nothing left to say to the world that had branded her a family killer. September 14th, 2005, 2 hours past midnight, the first Black woman executed in modern Texas history took her secrets to the grave. Frances Elaine McLemore was born on April 12, 1965, in Houston, Texas. By age 21, she had already accumulated a criminal record for forgery, earning 3 years probation in December 1985. She was a young mother trying to navigate a turbulent marriage with Adrian Newton, a relationship that had been crumbling for months. Adrian Newton was 23, a man who struggled with substance abuse and alleged involvement in drug dealing. Their marriage was a battlefield of accusations, infidelity, and financial strain. Both were seeing other people while still living under the same roof on Ella Boulevard in Northwest Houston. Frances was dating a man whose .25 caliber pistol would soon become central to a capital murder case. The couple had 2 children together. 7-year-old Alton was Frances's son from a previous relationship, whom Adrian had helped raise. 21-month-old Farrah was their daughter together, a toddler who would never see her 2nd birthday. The family lived in a modest apartment complex where neighbors described the Newtons as quiet but troubled. In March 1987, exactly 1 month before the murders, Frances Newton made a decision that would later seal her fate. She purchased $50,000 life insurance policies on both Adrian and baby Farrah, naming herself as a beneficiary. A policy already existed for Alton. Frances claimed she forged Adrian's signature to prevent him from discovering she had set aside money for the premiums. She said she wanted to secure their children's future in case anything happened. But prosecutors would later argue this was the moment Frances Newton decided to become a killer. April 7, 1987. Frances Newton told police she spent the afternoon apartment hunting with her cousin, looking for a new place to live away from Adrian. She claimed they were across town when her family was being murdered. Her story was simple and consistent. She was trying to escape a bad marriage, not plotting to end 3 lives. According to Frances, she and her cousin returned to the apartment complex around dinner time. That's when they discovered the bodies. Adrian was slumped forward at the kitchen table, as if he'd been surprised while eating. 7-year-old Alton lay face down in the living room, shot in the back. Baby Farrah was found in her crib, the smallest victim of what appeared to be an execution-style killing. Each victim had been shot with a .25 caliber pistol. The killer had used different bullets for each victim, suggesting deliberation rather than passion. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of robbery, no indication of a struggle. Whoever did this had been let into the apartment, moved methodically from room to room, and left without taking anything of value. Frances told investigators that Adrian had been in debt to a drug dealer known only as Charlie. She claimed Charlie had been pressuring Adrian for $500 he owed for narcotics. Frances suggested that Charlie had come to collect his money and, when Adrian couldn't pay, had eliminated the entire family to send a message to other debtors. Houston police officers noted Frances's behavior at the scene. She appeared calm, almost detached from the horror around her. While her cousin wept and neighbors gathered in shock, Frances answered questions with the precision of someone who had rehearsed her responses. Some officers found her composure unsettling. Others assumed it was shock. But the investigation was just beginning, and Frances Newton had no idea how much evidence would soon point directly at her. The Houston Police Department launched their investigation with Frances Newton as their primary suspect. The insurance policy she had purchased just weeks before the murders provided an obvious motive. $150,000 was a fortune for a young mother working minimum wage jobs. Detectives began building a case that would portray Frances not as a grieving widow, but as a calculating killer who had murdered her own family for money. The murder weapon became the cornerstone of the prosecution's case. The .25 caliber pistol belonged to a man Frances had been dating, someone she'd been seeing while still married to Adrian. Ballistics tests appear to confirm that the specific gun had fired the bullets that killed all 3 victims. Frances claimed she had never touched the weapon, but investigators found gunshot residue on her hands when they tested her at the scene. More damaging evidence emerged when police discovered that Frances had hidden the murder weapon at a relative's house shortly after the killings. During the trial, prosecutors painted Frances Newton as a woman who had coldly planned the execution of her family. They argued she had purchased the insurance policies, knowing she would soon collect on them. They claimed she had used her boyfriend's gun to create distance between herself and the murder weapon. They suggested her apartment hunting alibi was a carefully constructed cover story. The prosecution also highlighted Frances's criminal history, particularly her conviction for forgery just 2 years before the murders. On October 25, 1988, Frances Newton was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to die. She was 23 years old, the same age Adrian had been when he was killed. She would spend the next 17 years on a row, maintaining her innocence even as her appeals were systematically denied. In 2004, just hours before her scheduled execution, new information emerged that would force even hardened prosecutors to question whether they had sent an innocent woman to her death. Frances's new attorney, David Dow from the University of Houston Law Center, discovered something that had been overlooked for nearly 17 years. The ballistics evidence that formed the backbone of the state's case was not as solid as prosecutors had claimed. There were conflicting reports about whether police had recovered a second gun from the crime scene, and the ballistics test that linked Frances to the murder weapon contained significant inconsistencies. More disturbing was the revelation that crucial evidence had been improperly destroyed by the Houston Police Department. Chain of custody documents were missing. Test results had been lost or misplaced. The very foundation of the case against Frances Newton was crumbling under scrutiny. But the most explosive discovery came from an unexpected source. A relative of Frances who had been incarcerated shortly after the murders came forward with information he had kept secret for nearly 2 decades. He claimed that a fellow inmate had confessed to killing the Newton family, describing details about the crime scene that had never been made public. This revelation sent shockwaves through the legal community. If true, it meant that Frances Newton had been condemned to die based on circumstantial evidence, while the real killer had been bragging about his crimes in a jail cell just miles away from where Frances awaited execution. Governor Rick Perry, facing mounting pressure from victims' rights advocates, defense attorneys, and even some prosecutors, made an unprecedented decision. On December 1st, 2004, just 2 hours before Frances Newton was scheduled to die, Perry granted her a 120-day reprieve to allow new forensic testing of the ballistics evidence. The reprieve sparked a media frenzy. Supporters of Frances Newton argued that the state was rushing to execute an innocent woman. Critics claimed she was using legal technicalities to delay justice for 3 murdered victims. The case divided Texas, with some seeing Frances as a victim of prosecutorial misconduct, and others viewing her as a manipulative killer trying to escape responsibility for her crimes. The original test had been conducted using outdated methods, and some of the conclusions drawn by Houston police forensics experts could not be replicated using modern technology. Even more concerning was the discovery that 3 members of Francis's original jury had expressed doubts about the verdict. They had signed affidavits stating that if they had known about the ballistics inconsistencies and the potential confession by another prisoner, they might have voted differently. Even Adrian's parents, who had grown to believe Francis might be innocent, wrote a letter asking that her life be spared. Their plea was ignored. The ballistics controversy revealed something more troubling than one potentially wrongful conviction. It exposed systematic flaws in how Texas handled capital cases, from shoddy police work to prosecutorial tunnel vision to courts unwilling to reconsider convictions even when new evidence emerged. Francis Newton's case became a symbol of everything that could go wrong in the system, where the stakes were literally life and death. September 13th, 2005, Francis Newton spent what she knew might be her last day on Earth in a 6x10-foot cell at the Mountain View unit in Gatesville, Texas. She had exhausted nearly every legal option available to condemn prisoners. The Supreme Court had declined to hear her case without comment. Governor Perry had refused to grant another reprieve. The execution was scheduled for that evening. Francis's attorney, David Dow, made one final desperate attempt to save her life. He petitioned Perry for a 30-day stay, arguing that new ballistics tests could prove Francis had been wrongly convicted. Dow presented evidence that the original investigation had been contaminated by procedural errors and prosecutorial misconduct. He pleaded with the governor to delay the execution until independent experts could examine all the evidence. Perry's office remained silent. Throughout the day, Francis received visitors in the small room adjacent to the execution chamber. Her mother, Dolores McLemore, spent hours with her daughter, knowing these would be their last moments together. Friends and spiritual advisors came to offer comfort. Francis appeared calm, almost resigned to her fate. She had spent 17 years preparing for this moment. Prison officials followed their standard protocol for executions. Francis was offered a final meal, but she declined. She was asked if she wanted to make a last statement, but she refused. She had said everything she intended to say during her years of appeals and interviews. The woman who had maintained her innocence for nearly 2 decades would go to her grave without offering any final words of explanation, confession, or forgiveness. As evening approached, Francis was moved to a holding cell just steps from the execution chamber. The gurney where she would spend her final minutes had been prepared. For lines were ready to deliver the cocktail of drugs that would stop her heart. Witnesses began arriving, including representatives of the victims' families, media members, and Francis's supporters. At 6 p.m., Francis Newton was escorted into the execution chamber at the Huntsville unit. She was strapped to the gurney and connected to the 4 lines that would carry the lethal chemicals into her bloodstream. Prison officials went through their final checklist, ensuring everything was ready for Texas's 349th execution since the state resumed capital punishment in 1982. Francis Newton will become the 3rd woman executed in modern Texas history, following Carla Faye Tucker in 1998 and Betty Lou Beets in 2000. But unlike Tucker and Beets, Francis would die maintaining her innocence, taking her version of the truth with her into death. At exactly 6:12 p.m. on September 14, 2005, the warden gave a signal to begin the execution process. Francis Newton lay strapped to the gurney, her eyes closed, breathing slowly and deliberately. She had declined to make any final statement, so there were no last words to record, no final plea for forgiveness or declaration of innocence. The execution team began administering the lethal injection protocol used in Texas. First came sodium thiopental, a fast-acting barbiturate designed to render the condemned prisoner unconscious within seconds. Next was pancuronium bromide, a muscle relaxant that would paralyze Francis's respiratory system. Finally, potassium chloride would stop her heart. Francis Newton showed no visible reaction as the drugs entered her bloodstream. Her breathing became shallow, then stopped entirely. At 6:20 p.m., exactly 8 minutes after the execution began, she was pronounced dead. She was 40 years old. The witnesses filed out of the chamber in silence. There had been no dramatic final words, no emotional outburst, no last-minute confession. Frances Newton had died as she had lived her final years, quietly insisting on her innocence while the state of Texas insisted on her guilt. Outside the Huntsville unit, small groups of protesters had gathered. Some held signs demanding justice for Adrian, Alton, and Farrah Newton. Others carried placards questioning whether Frances had received a fair trial. The division that had marked her case in the beginning continued even after her death. Frances Newton's body was released to her family for burial. She was interred in Houston, not far from the apartment where 3 people had died 18 years earlier. Her grave marker bears only her name and dates of birth and death. There is no inscription proclaiming innocence or guilt, no final message to the world that had judged her.